Okay. Right, so welcome back everyone to the third talk for today, and I am delighted to welcome Kristine Knutter to the summit. Now, Kristine is a communication and career coach who has spent the last 9 years helping individuals who speak English as an additional language to communicate clearly, confidently, and persuasively to achieve their professional goals. She's the founder of Express to Impress, and she provides personalized coaching, interactive training programs, and accessible learning tools like her podcast and online courses. Welcome, Kristine. I am delighted that you're here at the summit.
Thank you, Claire. I'm just so happy to be here today and happy to see so many faces in the audience. Mhm. Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. So, what if I told you that the thing you're most nervous about in interviews, your accent, could actually help you stand out in a good way? Many multilingual job seekers worry that their accent or language background will hold them back, but the reality that is just that's not the case. It can set you apart in a really good way. It can show your global value and even increase your chances if you know how to own it. And so that is what we're going to be diving into today. I want to start off by telling you a very brief story about the first time I felt true dread, anxiety, panic, which is a feeling I think is really important for me as a interview coach to understand because that's what the people I work with feel every time they show up to an interview. And it's even more intense when they show up to an interview in an additional language. I was at a big fancy event in Kansas City, which is where I live. And Madeleine Albright, our former Secretary of State, was giving a big speech. And I was there, I was in the audience, and I did something that I often do. I raised my hand to ask a question, and something changed immediately in my body. And of course, it had to have happened in my mind first, but I felt it in my body. I completely panicked that I had just raised my hand to ask the Secretary of State a question in front of like a huge audience. I had this tightening feeling in my stomach, like this heaviness. I felt very um, uneasy, like even dizzy, and I thought I might pass out. And so I put my hand down and then I just sat there praying she wouldn't call on me and nobody would call on me. Nobody saw that my hand was raised because I also felt like all of the words and intelligence was gone. Like I wouldn't be able to, say anything intelligible if I was actually called upon. So that was really shocking to me to feel that way. And I definitely wasn't prepared to handle those big emotions and feelings and what was happening within my body. And and as I mentioned, this turned out to be a very valuable learning experience for me because I work with people with acute anxiety every day who are getting ready for interviews. So, one of the things we will be doing in our talk today is diving into how to manage your thoughts, your feelings during interviews so that you can put your best foot forward. And number one is simply thinking about interviewing in a second language differently, knowing that there are positives to it. It's not all negative. All right, so let's go ahead. I'm going to ask a quick question for the chat. If you could raise your hand or do the little hand signal if you've ever felt nervous that your accent would affect your interview chances. So I'll just pause here and we'll see who raises their hand. Yes. And Claire mentioned earlier she has interviewed in French before. She did not get the offer, unfortunately. But I mean, you did it, which is is huge and hard. All right. So, um, if anyone wants to, oh, I guess they could even just raise their hand physically because I can see you. Okay. Awesome. So certainly it's a very, very common fear that people have. Um, and that's, you know, these challenges are very real, but they're not fixed. And today we're going to talk about how you can turn those into um, opportunities. So, some of the things that people worry about related to speaking in another language, one could be the accent. They could worry they will be judged and not respected. They might worry they will be misunderstood. And what can happen is I've seen all of these things. So I've seen people who speak quickly because they feel that if they speak quickly, people will be less likely to notice the mistakes. I've also seen people speak very quietly because they're very nervous and they don't have that confidence. What else have I seen? I've seen people pausing for very long periods, even in the middle of talking. And as far as, handling these things, what's really important is to accept that you have an accent and look at it in a different way. It tells a story of resilience and adaptability. And it is part of who you are. And it's an incredible feat. Not everyone is able to speak in an additional language, and certainly not to the level of interviewing. So it's really important to remind yourself going into an interview, um, gosh, I've worked really hard on my English. Think of all those times I wanted to give up, or when I didn't think I could ever get to this level and I persisted. So building yourself up so that you feel pride in your abilities and not shame that they're, not where you wish they were. The other thing about accents, and Claire and I talked about this leading up to the summit, was that a lot of times people hear us speaking a different language differently than we envision they are. In some cases, it might even be alluring, like, oh, this sounds exotic. How fun. And you're suddenly the most interesting person in the room because they know you have different life experiences, you have stories to tell, and you're really impressive. Like you've worked so hard to learn this other language. So it's important to change the stories that we tell ourselves about what an accent means. Let's talk about another challenge that speakers face. They may struggle to find the right words, and they might worry they will make a mistake whenever they are in an interview. And one thing I tell people is, yeah, you are going to make mistakes, and you're not always going to have like the perfect word choice, and that's okay, because that's not what makes a person a great communicator, and it's not what allows them to connect with another human being and build trust. So giving yourself permission to make mistakes is really, really important. Because what can happen in an interview is if a person has set an unrealistic standard, I'm not going to make mistakes. I'm going to practice, practice, practice. And then when they show up to the interview and they make a mistake, then it affects their confidence and it affects the way they speak moving forward. Maybe they start having memory problems. Maybe their body language changes. They kind of slump and they're not speaking as loud. So it's really important to just accept that mistakes are part of interviews, even when people are speaking in their native language. So it's important to give ourselves that grace. Um, as I mentioned, if you're worried about these things, it can also lead to lots of pausing. It could also lead to filler words, overcorrecting mid-sentence. And what's most important is that you are connecting with the person, you're tuned into them, and you're noticing if they're getting a little confused or lost. And if they are, then that's appropriate to pause and clarify what you've said. You can also check in with them. Was that clear? Of course, I want to make sure you understand me. Happy to rephrase something. So there will be many moments and opportunities to course correct if needed. But most of the time, you know, using the wrong verb tense here or there, is not a big deal at all. As long as the person is able to follow along with your story, with what you're explaining, and you've prepared, then those small mistakes are not a barrier at all. And sometimes I wish people that I'm helping get ready for interviews could talk to some of the non-native English speakers working in American companies and realize their English is far from perfect. And yet they're able to project manage, they're able to, get awards and excel in their careers. So we have such a diversity of backgrounds in businesses in the United States, and we are so much better for it, to bring in all of these different perspectives. And, some people have come from incredible training programs and educational backgrounds and have so much to offer. And the employer sees that. They don't discriminate because the person has an accent or because they haven't used perfect grammar. Um, what's important is that they are able to understand you and you're able to clarify whenever there is a challenge, a communication challenge, which is just like if they were interviewing a native English speaker, those same things. So other challenges can be some cultural differences in interviews. One of the things that I work with people a lot on is coming across as more confident. For many English interviews, so especially in America, confidence is really important to selling yourself as the best person to do the job. And it can be incredibly frustrating for people that their resume doesn't do the selling itself, that they have to also be able to communicate not just in English, but in the American style of English, where they use the word I often and they use we less often in the interview. And I always tell people that research shows that confidence in an interview does help people get job offers, but it does not um, mean that the employer is selecting the best candidate. So it is simply what you need to do to be able to get job offers. It's a flawed system, but we just have to understand the system we're working within and play by those rules. And so that's what one of the things that I really work with people on is adapting to the culture that they're interviewing in. I love Erin Mayer's materials. She wrote the the culture map. She's written some other books as well, but it's been so helpful and she does it in such a wonderful way, very engaging author, lots of funny stories. And she simply helps people understand how our culture impacts the way we do business. And one of those ways is the way we communicate. And so this can be very helpful before you enter an interview in English, whether the interview is in the Netherlands or in the United States or in the UK. There are cultural differences, even though it's in English. So it's important to understand what is valued in that culture and to learn to communicate in that style. So if I were interviewing in English in the Netherlands, and I needed to tell a story about how I um, told somebody that they had um, done something wrong. And I would need to tell a story where I was quite direct with a person for them to feel confident that I could handle communication effectively in that cultural environment. Whereas in the United States, I would need to show a different approach. We use the sandwich method where we give a compliment, then we give the negative feedback, then we give um, another compliment. So it's super important to understand the culture in which you're interviewing and and also work with a coach, ideally, who has some experience with that culture and can give you feedback on the stories you're telling and how you're presenting yourself. But these are, yeah, this is something that's simply not related to your English skills. It comes down to your familiarity and research with, about the culture, and you can learn these things really quickly. That's the good news. This is, you know, learning a language takes a lot of time and commitment. Modifying an accent only if it's a problem, if there are certain sounds that are make it challenging for a person to understand you, that takes a lot of work. But learning about some of these cultural differences are a lot easier with the resources that we have available now. Um, and then other challenges are simply, I've met so many people who practice English on their own and they live somewhere where they don't get an opportunity to speak to people in English very often. And that makes it challenging when you're walking into an interview and you've been speaking Russian all day or you've been speaking in Chinese all day, and then suddenly you're expected to speak fluently and confidently in English. So with something like that, I always recommend to people to immerse themselves in English leading up to the interview and speak out loud, repeat what you're hearing. So you could be singing a song, you could also be watching a TV show and repeating what you're hearing so that you're speaking out loud. If you can book an English lesson before your interview, that's, very ideal. That helps to just warm up your mind and get access to all of that vocabulary. But yeah, that's a real challenge when people are just simply needing more practice speaking in English, so it's all fresh and accessible. All right, so would love to see in some comments if you have interviewed, whether that's in English or your native language, what is the hardest part of interviews for you? So I'll give you a minute here. Expected questions. Listening. Ah, great, great one. Yeah, we'll talk about that. So as others are adding the challenges they have faced, I'm going to go ahead and touch on these 2 points here. So unexpected questions. First, your mindset. You want to tell yourself, no matter how much I prepare, I will be asked unexpected questions. And that's okay. Other people are too. And I think it's wise for employers to ask people, common questions as well as a few that they wouldn't be able to prepare for, because it can show a person's adaptability, how they think through something, if they're able to maintain their composure, and quite honestly, to see what their English skills are whenever they haven't prepared for a question. Um, One of the things that happens is when people are preparing for an interview in another language is they can really invest a lot of time in preparing. And so the questions they've prepared for are excellent, but then the other questions are sound quite different. Um, that's okay. I think what's most important is to take some time to pause, you know, and you're thinking in your mind, no problem. I knew this would happen. And simply think about what you can talk about. So it's starting with, great question. I just need a few moments to gather my thoughts. And then you think about the story you're going to tell. Ideally, you'll already know what framework you'll be using to tell a story, like the STAR format, or it could be hypothetical question, situational question. What would you do if, um, a colleague did something unethical? And so you simply want to take a little time to think so you can talk about one or two points. Your answer doesn't have to be perfect, but you want to gather your thoughts a bit and then begin your answer and walk them through your answer and why. And I think the biggest mistake is when a person feels like a failure for not being ready for that question. So the mindset aspect. And two, when they start talking immediately and they're not prepared. It's much better to ask for a little bit of time to think and then to give an answer. All right. And listening. Yes. So listening, I'm glad you brought this up. Sometimes when you're interviewing, you will be talking to somebody who speaks the language in a very different way than you're used to. I have worked with many people getting ready for interviews in English, and they might be interviewing with somebody from India. They might be interviewing with somebody from Australia. They might be interviewing with somebody from America, and they might be interviewing with somebody from Germany. And it will all be in English, but all very different accents. And that can be a real challenge to get your ears ready to process the language spoken in so many different ways. So I mentioned to Claire, getting ready for the summit, a resource that I love. It's called IDEA. The website is International Dialect. I can't remember what the acronym, all of those words mean, but maybe she can throw that in the chat here. But the IDEA website is excellent because you can go to any country and even like different regions within the country, and you can listen to audio clips of people speaking English. So it might say, 26-year-old woman, 85-year-old man, and you can hear them speaking English and start to acclimate yourself to their accent. That helps tremendously if you know you will be interviewing with people with different English accents. All right. And you should and you have every right to speak up for yourself and your needs. And that's something I really, really encourage people to do is if you don't understand a question, ask them to rephrase it, ask them to repeat it. I have always leaned into the fact that Spanish is not my first language. I would really appreciate if you could speak a little slower. I want to answer your question. I just need to understand you. So if you smile, you make it charming, and you're feeling that connection with a person, it's not going to be a problem at all for them to slow down a little bit. But if you don't do that, it only hurts you. I've met a lot of people who answer even if they don't even know what the question was, and it's simply because they feel shame that they didn't understand it. And just remind yourself, you have every right to do this. Even in your native language, you would need to speak up for yourself if somebody were speaking too quickly. So this is not a negative reflection on you. All right, finding examples for behavioral questions. Yeah, this is one of the absolute most challenging aspects of any interview. And I really recommend to people they come up with like 10 to 20 stories that you could tell in an interview. That's a lot of stories. But coming up with stories on the spot, I've never met a person who's told me like that's easy for them. It really is hard if you are in an interview and asked about something specific. But if you have 10 to 20 stories and you can apply them to all different situations, that really comes in handy. Understanding. So yeah, similar to listening, it will be important to ask them to clarify what they said. You can also repeat back what you understood and then ask for clarification. So I understand you're wanting me to talk about a time somebody disappointed me and how I responded. Is that correct? I want to make sure I answer your question fully. Sometimes interviewers are not the best communicators. They're not the best speakers. Maybe they ask you three questions in a row. Maybe they're talking and then suddenly their intonation goes up and you realize they've asked you a question. So you need to give yourself permission to ask for clarification anytime there is a misunderstanding. All right. So yeah, like spontaneous questions we talked about, lack of vocabulary. Yes, this one is challenging. I admit this is the challenge of speaking in another language, like whether it's an interview or not. And I just encourage people to allow themselves to use whatever vocabulary you have to convey the idea. I know that whenever I'm speaking in Spanish, sometimes I have to pause a little bit and then say something in a way that I know is going to sound a little funny, but it's going to get the point across. And the person might even speak up and give me the vocabulary that I need. But it's that adaptability and permission to say it in whatever way you need to convey the point. But that's part of the language learner's journey. And I wouldn't be hard on yourself for that. Awesome. Okay. Glad we could make it through those there. All right. Let's talk about another way that you can prepare for interviews to really lock in a positive mindset. What I always encourage people to do is designate 15 minutes before your interview as like a sacred time that only belongs to you and helping yourself get into the best mental place possible before the interview. So, phone is muted, notifications turned off, you're not working, you're not preparing for the interview. The only thing you're doing is getting in a really positive headspace. Ideally, just getting in a happy mood. So you show up genuinely smiling and happy to be there. There are so many different ways you could do this, but some of the best presenters and interviewers in the world, they all have routines like a professional athlete. They have their routine that leads them to success. And so you want to experiment with what that routine looks like for you. For some people, it's listening to their favorite music that just gets the endorphins going, puts them in a different headspace, maybe creative. For me, I watch funny cat videos. It can be any animals, but cats always do it for me. Um, some people do power poses. It's a trend since there was a very famous TED Talk on power poses. Some people meditate, some people pray, but give yourself the best opportunity to show up and put your best foot forward. And so that's for any interview in your second language or first language, but especially in your second language, you want to give yourself that time because otherwise you could show up with that, ball of anxiety in your stomach where you've been worrying about it. But if you have a plan and that plan involves getting in a great mood, that's going to help you start off the interview really strong and able to connect with your interviewers. The other piece of advice is to coach and mentor yourself throughout the interview. It's treating yourself like you would your best friend. So if you have a thought that comes up that's negative, you immediately are coaching yourself through that. So, oh, I just pronounced that word. I put the accent on the E instead of the A, and you're disappointed with yourself, then you're quickly, that's not going to make or break this interview, and then you just keep moving on. So whatever fears that come up, whatever, criticisms that come up, you want to keep coaching yourself through those leading up to the interview and during that interview. All right. So let's now talk about reframing your accent as an asset. So we talked about this a little bit already, but It'll be important for you to think about this and journal about this leading up to your interview so that you fully believe it. Um, so thinking about multilingualism, this is an incredibly valuable skill. This is something that only people who are willing to work really hard for it are able to accomplish, unless they're raised in a multilingual environment. But most people have learned the hard way in classes with a teacher, studying on their own, doing flashcards. And ultimately, that gives you a skill that is going to be very valuable. You will be able to not only have the language skills to bring to the job, which is increasingly important and valuable, but you will also be able to show like a story of resilience as well as adaptability. Of course, problem solving as well. So there's just so many positive attributes, that and skills that you develop whenever you learn another language, not just the language skills. Um, and of course, employers need multilingual skills. They also need people who understand and can connect with other cultures. So it can mean the difference between a company's success and their failure. If they have people who can connect with their customers and their clients in their native language. So it's an incredibly valuable skill that you have to offer. This is an asset that you should be proud of. Sometimes I have found that if you are speaking with somebody who doesn't know another language, it is important to give them some context so they can better appreciate what you bring to the table. So sometimes people ask me, so are you fluent in Spanish? And that's just such a complicated question. And I explained that when you're learning another language, it is a journey that never ends. And I have an advanced level of Spanish, and I've worked really hard at it. Most people, they take some classes in college or high school and they lose it. I've worked really hard to retain that. And that means listening to podcasts in Spanish. That means watching shows in Spanish, traveling to Spanish-speaking countries where I can use it, making friends and going to restaurants and where I can speak Spanish. And it means that I still do flashcards at 41 years old. So and even with that, if I had to name all of the insects in Spanish, no way. I know some insects, and if I know that I'm going to be speaking about a particular topic, I'm going to study that vocabulary to make sure I know it and it's fresh. But it's very, very different learning a language as an adult versus growing up, and we really take that for granted. So, because otherwise it can be really hard for a person to grasp like what that looks like to be able to speak another language. And most people who don't, and I would say I face that more in the US than I have seen outside of the US. But that context can be very helpful for people. All right, what else do we have here? I know I had a question I wanted to ask. Let's see here. Give me just a moment. Okay, so one question that I have is when you are speaking in English, do you sometimes have people ask you to slow down or clarify what you've said? So have you ever faced that sort of thing? So you can do like raise of hands, do a little comment. Yeah. Yeah, so I would say this is also a common concern when people are learning another language is whenever they do build up the confidence to speak in it, when others respond by asking them to clarify what they mean, or asking them to slow down, that sort of thing. The most common thing I get when I'm speaking a Spanish is people tell me I can go ahead and speak faster. They're like, "Oh, you're great. You just need to speak faster." Like, are you kidding me? It's like totally innocent. There's a lot that goes into that. One, I'm from a region in the US where we speak a little slower. I'm from the Midwest. Spanish, most Spanish speakers are always going to sound like they're in a race to my ears, the pace of Spanish. Secondly, it's my second language. It's like, even if you learn a language well, it's still hard to get your brain synapses to fire as quickly as you would like them to. Um, so yeah, looks like this has been a common situation that some people have faced. And what I would say is this is part of the experience. And you also want to like just have that mindset shift that this is a normal part of any communication, but especially when speaking another language. What I would say is it's a gift. It's a true gift if somebody will tell you when they don't understand you. Because the bigger problem is when people don't tell you that they don't understand you. And a lot of people have come to me for lessons over the years because they say, my English, I know it's at a higher level, but I want to take it to the next level. And now it's really hard to because nobody tells me when I make mistakes, but they used to when I was at a little bit lower level. And so when a person tells you they don't understand, that means they care about what you're saying and they want to connect with you. So it's just I just challenge you to think of it as a gift, as an opportunity for learning. It is hard. I would simply tell you whenever something is a little uncomfortable to us, that is the absolute best opportunity for learning. So whenever we make, that mistake and it's brought to our attention, maybe we feel a little bit of shame initially, but then we say, this is a gift and I'm not going to do this again. Um, but also, yeah, in an interview, it's just, and I would even like welcome it. So at the beginning of an interview, you can say, and it depends on where you're at in your English journey. But for many people, I think it makes sense to say something like, as you know, English is not my first language. I and I want to make sure that I'm clear. So if at any time you don't understand me, please let me know. I'm happy to clarify. So that shows a very high level of self-awareness, confidence to even be able to say that, and consideration for the person that you are speaking to. So, and for me, that also just gives me this little comfort, like I've already named the elephant in the room, and it gives me permission to make mistakes because my thought is, well, they're going to bring up if I'm saying anything that's unclear. All right. Awesome. So moving on here. Let's see my notes here. Okay. Um, so let's transition to strategies to succeed in job interviews. Oh my goodness, I just saw the time. Okay. I really got to talking here. Thank you for your patience here. Okay, so I'm going to zip through strategies to succeed so I can give you an opportunity to answer questions. And we've covered a lot of this already. But that self-intro is super important, and you will already be walking in a great mood. But you also want to make that great first impression by being ready with that self-intro. So out of all of the questions to practice, that's a really important one. And that's where you would include your language learning and wanting to be clear. Also want to make sure you know how to tell stories. Stories are a very important part of interviews. And once you master the most common format is like the STAR format, the situation, task, action, results, reflection, that's going to give you confidence as well. And Slowing down is going to be incredibly important too. So I mentioned sometimes people speed up whenever they want to mask their language abilities, but people will be able to understand you better whenever you do slow down, you emphasize words, you pause. So, as I've mentioned, I speak Spanish slower than native Spanish speakers. To me, that is not a big surprise. And I don't, it doesn't bother me, even when people tell me, like, yeah, you're great, just speak faster. Um, but in an interview, it's especially important to slow down and be deliberate, and that's going to enhance clarity and they will be able to, like, if you do pronounce something a little bit differently and their brain needs the time to process what that means, when you speak slowly, it gives them that opportunity. Um, okay, so those were the main things. We'd already covered some others. And then just practicing before interviews is also going to give you that confidence. There are just more and more incredible tools out there that will even give you feedback on your accent. I use something called Yoodli, Yoodli, and it analyzes your speech. It gives you feedback on filler words, pacing, eye contact, conciseness. It tells you how you could have said things in a more concise way, and it cleans up any grammar issues, and it even highlights accent, like exactly like sounds to focus on. So many tools out there to help with. Um, but that really concludes my speech, my presentation that I had for today, and I would love to stick around and ask any questions from anyone.
Thank you so much, Kristine. There were so many tips there, and I hope people had a chance to write things down. I did make a few notes as we were going through, but obviously, now we have Kristine with us, and obviously she's an expert in American interviews as well. If you have questions for her, please do write them in the chat. And in fact, I'm really wanted to ask Kristine to give us a bit more information actually about the cultural aspect of having interviews in the States. I don't know how many of you here are thinking, okay, one day I would like to interview, maybe not necessarily for the States, but for an American company. You gave a fantastic example of, for example, for American interviews, it's going to be more saying I rather than we. So if you've got questions, guys, please do write them in the chat. But I actually wanted to ask Kristine this now while you're writing your questions. Can you give more examples of how people might expect you to behave in an American interview?
Yes, yes, that's a great question. All in all, I typically the most common feedback I get is how casual interviews feel in America versus interviews in, their home country. So that's a very common theme. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but that's the most common feedback I get. So you want to approach an interview like you're having a conversation with a friend. And sometimes I even tell people, like, imagine somebody maybe that's your sister, maybe that's your niece. That can help because I know that's really hard to like fast track the rapport building process and act that way, but that's a very American style. Um, that's a really important one. Also, your stories need to show some alignment with what the employer expects from you, expects for how you will have handled situations. And sometimes I will face a situation where a person tells me a story and I say, "Oh, that would not work in America." But of course, that's your true experience, and it worked in Korea, for example. But what will be important is for you to acknowledge that you understand things are handled differently in America, and you would be willing to try things in a new way. So, an example of that would be, in Korea, people are less likely to be confrontational and they are more indirect in their communication. So, in the like if there was an employee had made a mistake, they would be much less likely to talk about it publicly. Um, it would be spoken about in a more indirect way. And so if like a manager was talking about how they handled something, the American might be like, "Wait, did you actually give them negative feedback?" It would be too nuanced and subtle for us. And so that would be an important difference to show at least understanding of and willingness to try the American communication style just so that you're effective in the workplace.
Yeah, that's lovely. So yes, from that I get that it's much more informal. And you might be expecting, I don't know, 12 people going to fire questions at you, but no, it's going to be you need to build rapport really quickly. Yes, lovely. Thank you. So we have some questions. Um, in American companies, who conducts interviews more often, native speakers or not? Because in European countries, so this is Vadim has met Russian and Spanish speakers as HR specialists.
Yes. So I would say it depends on the field which you're entering. Like if you're going into engineering or technology, you're very likely to have some, you know, non-native speakers interviewing you. Um, and because some people on the team are going to want to meet you, and those fields attract people from all different cultural backgrounds. In some other fields, it's going to be like less likely, but I mean, it's hard to name fields that are not, culturally diverse in the US. But those two fields especially are really dominated by people who speak English as an additional language. Um, but yeah, it's certainly possible that you will have a hiring manager in the US who doesn't speak English as their first language. I've worked with, individuals like that. Um, so you'll speak with both. I have met a lot of students and clients who have told me they feel more comfortable speaking with somebody who speaks English as a second language. They're much more likely to use common vocabulary, and they're more likely to speak more slowly and be more empathetic. I would say some of that's also like mindset. They might assume they would be more empathetic. That's not a given. Um, but it's certainly understandable, like that you would feel that way. But I always tell people, do your research before an interview, no matter who, like what interview. You want to know like the person's background, and if you need to, like get on the IDEA website and get familiar with that accent before you show up to an interview.
Lovely, that's lovely advice. Yes, and a comment from Connie that in research institutes, the most interviewers are not native speakers. So that's
Oh,
also very, very
yeah.
interesting.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, yeah, and briefly, I know we're running out of time here, but um, yeah, I told Claire leading up to this conversation that I've interviewed in Spanish, and it was with all native Spanish speakers. So it was a bit intimidating. I tend to understand people a little bit better whenever they're, you know, English speakers who learn Spanish and then speak it with me. But yeah, it's just asking them to slow down a bit and then, speaking up if you don't understand something, and then really laying on the enthusiasm for the job and showing you showed up prepared.
I love the way that you always emphasize, Kristine, that the communication isn't just down to you, it's also down to the other person. So if you don't understand the interviewer, then ask. And as you said, it's your right to make sure that you understand the question. And in fact, this has also been echoed by Nina, who made the comment that I like it when people ask me to clarify or repeat something. If not, I get worried, thinking maybe they don't listen or they don't understand. So it's a really, really good way of just checking in with the other person, with the interviewer. Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much. Now, I wonder if anyone has any other questions or comments, anything they want to ask Kristine while she is with us. We can take advantage of her. I don't want to take up too much of her time, but she is here. If anybody has any questions for her, or anyone who wants to make a comment.
And Claire, I'm just going to tag on to something you said earlier. In American culture, it's completely appropriate to ask somebody to clarify or to ask somebody to repeat. And I know that sometimes it is perceived as rude in certain cultures to make these sorts of requests. But I just want to reassure you that in American culture, fully acceptable, and it even shows confidence. So, and that is the most important thing in interviews, is projecting that confidence. Well, I say the most important. I would say the second most important thing, the first most important thing is to make a connection with your interviewer.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you very much. So, yes, Solomia says thank you. It was very interesting. Really glad that you enjoyed it, Solomia. If there are no other questions or comments for Kristine, I would just like to say thank you once again for such an interesting presentation. Yes, Catherine says thank you very much. It's really, really fascinating for me to find out more about American interviews. I'm only really um, an expert, shall we say, in UK interviews, or my disastrous French interview. So yes, Nina says many thanks for your wonderful talk, the points you raised, the tips you gave us, stories from your personal experience. All this is priceless. I really enjoyed your talk. Wow, thank you so much for such a lovely comment. Thank you from Connie and from Linnea. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. No, sorry, Linya. Sometimes I don't understand phrasal verbs. Ah, okay. How do I ask to clarify phrasal verbs? Good question, Linya. Kristine.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Um, I would simply, smile and say, "I'm afraid I don't follow you. I haven't heard that before. Um, could you clarify?" And then say what you just heard. Could you clarify what you mean by? And then you just say, "Ah, I've learned something new. Thank you." So it's just keeping the charm, showing the confidence, asking for that clarification, and oh, I'm afraid I don't follow you when you said this. So don't be afraid to jump in there and say that.
Yeah, perfect. So phrasal verbs are very difficult. And I think if one of the problems with native speakers is that we don't understand that they are complicated because we use them all the time. So we think they're quite simple, and of course they're not. Yes, good call. Thank you very much. Right. Thank you. Thank you so much again, Kristine, and for
Oh,
sharing your experience with us and your expertise with interviews. And I'd like to say thank you very much to everyone who's come to the session today. We have one session tomorrow at 10 a.m. with Craig Whelan, and Craig's going to be talking about presentation skills. And then at 6 p.m. tomorrow, we have our final party. Come along, meet each other, meet us, get together, and we can have a lovely chat. Thank you very much indeed. Have a lovely evening, everyone. And thank you once again, Kristine, for such an informative talk. It was really, really useful. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Bye for now.
thank you,
Bye-bye.
Claire. This has been wonderful. Bye-bye.
Thank you. My pleasure, Nina. I just wanted to say thank you very much indeed for a lovely, lovely comment. Thank you.